Hi, this week we wanted to focus on the American chestnut tree, and then later this week we're going to do some activities related to it. Most of this will be kind of some field work outside in the actual orchard. So here's the story. So a long time ago, the American chestnut tree was a really tall, important tree in our ecosystem and for the livelihood of people. It grew all in this green area. This is its range. So all the way from a little north of Massachusetts down the East Coast, and then well into like Georgia and Alabama area. But something happened, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, here's some pictures from the 1800s of how tall these trees used to be. And these used to grow in Massachusetts, believe it or not. So you can see by the people in the photo that they were really big trees compared to the size of people. And they were used all the time for all kinds of different things. Here's another picture. This is like a whole family in front of the trees. You can see there's 5 people in this picture. So imagine how big that tree must have been. And if you're thinking right now that this kind of reminds you of like the redwood trees on the West Coast, these had the nicknames the redwoods of the East, and they were everywhere in Massachusetts. People used to, like, for fun, would almost like how we use apple picking for like a favorite pastime in the fall. People would go out and like this kid is throwing a stick at the tree and he's making all these chestnut burrs fall from the tree. And a burr is like a spiky outer coating of where the seeds are. So inside that burr are the seeds. And there's a picture of a burr a little bit later in the slideshow. So these trees were really important for lots of different reasons. They're a very hard wood, but they're lightweight at the same time, and they're rot resistant. So they were great for fences and houses and all kinds of things that you would use lumber for. People that lived on farms used to feed their livestock chestnuts, and the people would eat them as well. So if you've ever heard the song "Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire," that's because people used to roast chestnuts and have them to eat. They would use them in like different food recipes, and they were like just as popular as apples were. But then something happened. These trees all started dying, and people reported like they'd go to bed at night and just hear all these trees crashing in the woods. And in a period of about 50 years, from 1904 to like 1950s, these trees started dying, right? And they started dying up towards the uppermost part of their habitat, and then slowly worked its way down through that whole range. And by 1950, the American chestnut tree was actually pretty much wiped out. Here's a picture of just the remnants of an old tree in the woods that had fallen. And so what people started to notice was that this orange stuff was all over these trees, and it would start out, just a little bit, but then eventually it would wrap itself around the whole tree, basically like cutting off all the circulation of the tree. Couldn't get all the things that it would need to survive, and eventually they started dying. And this was happening across that whole range. Trees are just being wiped out, and it only took 50 years to wipe out this entire species. And so what they found out was that where this all came from was actually brought by humans. So this is a picture of the Bronx Zoo. And in 1904, so not only do they have animals at the zoo, but they also have plants. And in 1904, they brought over a Chinese chestnut tree to put in the arboretum so that people could see all kinds of exotic trees. What they didn't know, and this happens all the time with invasive species, is that the Chinese chestnut carried that fungus, that orange stuff that you saw. It's called Cryphonectria parasitica, and it's a fungus that grew on the Chinese chestnut tree, but it didn't kill the Chinese chestnut tree. But when it got to the United States and that fungus traveled through the air in spores and got on our American chestnut trees, it did kill it. Our trees were not resistant, didn't have the right genetics to not get the blight, which is what the disease is called, and it eventually killed all those trees. So the fungus came from a tree that was brought to the Bronx Zoo. The American Chestnut Foundation and Research Farm in Virginia started, I want to say about 30 years ago. They've been working on a project to restore the chestnut tree. So it's not actually extinct. It's a term called functionally extinct, which means they can't grow to their original state with those huge, huge trees. They do just kind of sprout out here and there, and then they eventually die because they get the blight, so they don't get big like they used to. So what the American Chestnut Foundation did was they said, well, we've got Chinese chestnut. Those have some sort of genetics that makes them resistant. And then we have the American chestnut tree, which is not. So they crossed those. And the first time they cross it, it's like a 50-50 cross. It's half Chinese, half American. And they keep crossing it. It's actually called a back cross. And they keep doing it until we eventually get where the American Chestnut Foundation is now. And they have trees that are 15th, 16th American chestnut and 1/16th Chinese chestnut. And the benefit of that is it looks just like an American chestnut tree, and it has enough of the Chinese chestnut genetics in it to make it resistant to the blight. So here's how Tantasqua got involved, and this has really all happened by chance. If you remember, about 10 years ago, the 10-year anniversary is actually this June, there was a tornado, and it was devastating. It wiped out a lot of areas in Munson, Brimfield, and parts of Sturbridge. But there was a silver lining to this. I mean, of course, the devastation is horrible. This picture just, is people loss of their houses and property, and the devastation that it caused is bad. But what it did was it caused a way for chestnut trees to sprout out. So what happens is the fungus attacks it from the ground up. Anything that's underground is not affected by the fungus. So even though all of these huge trees have died, if you get the right conditions, the roots will still sprout out. Now, they don't usually get that big because they usually get the blight and die, and the cycle keeps happening over and over again. However, Mr. Green, who is the blue team science teacher, knew a little bit about the American chestnut tree from some college classes he took. And he was walking in his hometown of Munson at this place called Mount Ella, which is in Flint Park. And he found out that, he was looking and he's like, wow, there seems to be a lot of sprouts of American chestnut trees. And this was like maybe 5 years after the tornado. And there were so many that it just kind of made him start asking questions. And he went to the American Chestnut Foundation and he started talking to the people there. And we ended up finding that these were actually pure American chestnut trees, and they were growing on Mount Ella because the bigger trees have been wiped out. And now there was enough sun and space and all the things that those trees needed to start sprouting out. And they actually got big enough where they flowered, which was a huge, big deal because usually they don't grow that big. So it was just really by chance that all this happened and someone noticed. So Mr. Green, was thinking and he came back to school and talked to the 7th grade science teachers. He's like, how can we get this into our curriculum? Because this is such a cool story. How can we do something with this? And we ended up partnering with the American Chestnut Foundation to create what's out in the front of the school, which is our research orchard. This project has been going on for about 6 years. The kids that are in this picture, this was the first year we did anything. These kids were in 7th grade, and they are now currently seniors. This is up on Mount Ella. That's the first burr that we ever found, and you can tell we were very excited to find this burr from a chestnut tree. And so we worked with the American Chestnut Foundation to create an orchard in the front of our school. But first we had to pollinate trees on Mount Ella. So the foundation gave us pollen that was 15/16 American to Chinese. We took the pollen, we went to Mount Ella, we pulled down tree branches, stripped the branches of their leaves, and then pollinated these flowers. We put bags on them to protect them from being pollinated by anything else. And we let them stay that way over the summer. And in the fall, we harvested the nuts. So this is the burr that I was telling you about. And on the right is what the chestnut looks like. It's inside of that burr. And we harvested these chestnuts. We kept them in a special refrigerator over the winter. And then in the spring, we planted them in milk cartons, grew them in under grow lights in our classrooms, and then eventually moved them out to the orchard where we planted them. So these are some just various pictures of us planting with the milk cartons. These are some tools we got from a grant, and this is some work we do up on Mount Ella because we still help to manage that area and plant chestnut trees on the top of the mountain as well as at school. So remember, these are crossed from pure American chestnut trees and the hybrid cross that is supposed to be blight resistant. And what we're creating is regionally adapted blight resistant trees, which means our trees are able, we're taking pollen from trees that grow in Massachusetts where it gets colder. And so they'd be a little bit more hardier in cooler temperatures as opposed to the trees that are being grown in Virginia. And the orchard has about 200 trees in it right now. And those trees are planted. Hopefully, we'll eventually get some that will be able to flower and then produce seeds. And then those will go to a seed orchard where they'll grow those to plant in other places, and hopefully to bring these back, the species from this functionally extinct level to actually thriving back into the ecosystem. That's the goal. And this whole project, not just Tantasqua, but with the American Chestnut Foundation, is the biggest de-extinction project to ever exist. And Tantasqua gets to be a part of it, which is a really, really cool opportunity. And so we picked the area out in the front of the school. It's all mapped out. We have some of our hybrid crosses from Mount Ella, but we also have purebred American chestnut trees and purebred Chinese chestnut trees to do some data collection about how they grow and what's surviving. Eventually, when these trees get big enough, we're going to inoculate them with the fungus to see if they get blight. If they are not resistant and they get the blight, then those trees will be removed. And then we estimate that at the end of the whole process, we will have like 1 or 2 trees that survive everything and hopefully are regionally adapted blight-resistant trees. So that's kind of the quick version of the story of our research orchard and its connection to the story of the American chestnut tree. And we're going to be spending some time outside this week working in the orchard, collecting data, and also planting some seeds. So we'll be working on that in class, and I can't wait to get started on some of this work because this is really such a cool project that is like real science. Like it's not just like stuff you learn in class, like we're actually doing genetics and science and planting and restoring a species to its former glory. So thanks for listening, and I will see you guys in class later this week as we continue to work on our ecology unit.